The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her rental car. She had deliberately chosen civilian clothes for this assignment, a simple navy blazer and slacks that gave no hint of her true rank or purpose. The mission briefing had been clear. Conduct an undercover assessment of base operations and personnel management without revealing her identity as a Pentagon-appointed inspector. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at his office window, watching the woman walk across the courtyard with interest. He had been expecting some sort of civilian consultant, though the details had been vague in the memo from headquarters. What he hadn't expected was someone who looked so young and, in his opinion, so obviously out of place on a military installation. Sarah approached the main administrative building, noting everything from the condition of the facilities to the demeanor of the soldiers she passed. Her trained eye caught details that most would miss: the slightly relaxed posture of some guards, the minor maintenance issues that suggested budget constraints or poor oversight, and the general atmosphere that seemed more casual than what regulations typically demanded. Inside the building, she was directed to Colonel Webb's office by a sergeant who barely looked up from his paperwork. The lack of proper protocol wasn't lost on her, but she filed the observation away mentally rather than commenting. Her job was to observe, not to correct. At least not yet. Colonel Webb's office was exactly what she had expected. Walls lined with commendations and photographs from his 20-year career, a large desk positioned to assert authority, and an American flag standing prominently in the corner. The man himself was tall and imposing, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that came from years of unquestioned command. "You must be the consultant from Washington," Webb said, not bothering to stand as she entered. His tone carried just enough courtesy to avoid being openly rude, but the dismissive undertone was unmistakable. "I have to say, I'm surprised they sent someone so young. This isn't exactly entry-level work." Sarah simply smiled and extended her hand. Sarah Mitchell. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me, Colonel." Webb shook her hand briefly, his grip unnecessarily firm, a common power play she had encountered many times before. "Well, Miss Mitchell, I suppose we should get this over with. I have real military business to attend to, and I'm sure you have your report to write for whatever desk job is waiting for you back in D.C. The condescending tone was clear, but Sarah maintained her professional composure. "I understand you're busy, Colonel. Perhaps you could start by giving me an overview of your command structure and daily operations." Webb leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Listen, sweetheart. I've been running military operations since before you were probably even thinking about college. I'm not sure what they told you in whatever civilian training program you came from, but this isn't some corporate office where you can just walk in and start asking questions." The use of sweetheart was deliberate and calculated to establish dominance. Sarah had heard worse and from higher-ranking officers, but she noted the pattern of behavior that was already emerging. "I understand your position, Colonel. However, I do have authorization from the Pentagon to conduct this assessment. Perhaps we could review the documentation?" Webb waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm sure you have all the right paperwork. They always send someone with the right paperwork. But paperwork doesn't give you the experience to understand what really goes on in a place like this. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, what's your background? Administrative assistant? Budget analyst? Some kind of human resources position?" Each guess was delivered with increasing disdain, and Sarah could see that Webb was enjoying what he perceived as his intellectual and experiential superiority. She had encountered this type of officer before, competent enough to maintain their position, but limited by their own arrogance and inability to recognize expertise that didn't come wrapped in the uniform they expected. "I have experience in military operations, Colonel," she replied simply, not elaborating further. Her instructions were clear about maintaining her cover, and she saw no reason to satisfy his curiosity with details that might compromise her mission. "Military operations," Webb repeated with a laugh. "Right. Let me guess. You read some reports, maybe visited a base or two, as part of some study group. That's not the same as being boots on the ground making life-and-death decisions, managing hundreds of personnel under combat conditions." He stood up and walked to his wall of photographs, pointing to several that showed him in various military settings. "This is from my deployment in Afghanistan. I commanded a battalion in some of the heaviest fighting the region saw. And this one here is from Iraq, where I managed logistics for an entire division." That's real experience, Miss Mitchell. That's what qualifies someone to understand military operations. Sarah studied the photographs with genuine interest, noting the dates and locations. Her own service record included many of the same areas, often during the same time periods, though her role had been quite different from Webb's. Those look like challenging assignments, Colonel. I'm sure you gained valuable experience. Challenging? Webb turned back to her with a look of disbelief. Lady, you have no idea what challenging means. Sitting in some air-conditioned office in Washington, pushing papers and attending meetings, that's not challenging. Having insurgents shooting at your convoy while you're trying to coordinate supply runs for 3,000 troops, that's challenging. The lecture continued as Webb clearly warmed to his favorite topic, himself and his military accomplishments. Sarah listened patiently, occasionally asking questions that seemed to satisfy his need to demonstrate his superior knowledge and experience. She was learning far more about his leadership style and attitude toward subordinates than any formal interview could have revealed. The problem with people like you, Webb continued, settling back into his chair, is that you think you can understand the military from the outside. You read reports, you analyze data, you attend briefings, and then you think you're qualified to make recommendations about how we should operate. But you've never had to make a split-second decision that could get your soldiers killed. You've never had to maintain morale when everything is going wrong and resources are running low. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You're right that decision-making under pressure is a unique aspect of military leadership. How do you handle that responsibility with your current command? The question seemed to please Webb, as it gave him another opportunity to showcase his expertise. It's all about establishing clear authority and maintaining discipline. These young soldiers today, they need strong leadership. They need to know that when I give an order, it's not a suggestion, it's a direct command that will be followed without question. And how do you ensure your orders are appropriate and well-informed? Sarah asked. Webb looked at her as if she had asked something particularly naive. Experience, Miss Mitchell. 20 years of experience. I don't need to second-guess myself because I've seen it all before. When you've been through what I've been through, you develop instincts that can't be taught in any classroom or training program. The conversation continued in this vein for another hour, with Webb alternating between dismissive comments about her qualifications and lengthy monologues about his own accomplishments. Sarah took careful mental notes, not just about his obvious arrogance and sexist attitudes, but about the more subtle indicators of his leadership approach that were emerging. When subordinates knocked on the door with questions or reports, Webb's tone shifted noticeably. He was curt and impatient with enlisted personnel, barely civil with junior officers, and seemed to take particular pleasure in finding fault with their work. The pattern was consistent and telling. He ruled through intimidation rather than inspiration. You see what I'm dealing with? Webb said after dismissing a nervous lieutenant who had brought a routine status report. Half these people can't think for themselves. They need constant supervision and correction. It's not like the old days when soldiers had real discipline. Sarah watched the lieutenant hurry away and noticed the relieved expressions on the faces of other personnel in the outer office. It must be frustrating to work with people who aren't meeting your standards, she said carefully. Frustrating doesn't begin to cover it, Webb replied. But that's what separates real leaders from the wannabes. I don't coddle them or try to be their friend. I demand excellence, and if they can't deliver, they need to find another career. As the morning progressed, Sarah was introduced to various department heads and key personnel. Webb made a point of presenting her as the consultant from Washington who's here to observe our operations, always with a tone that suggested she was wasting everyone's time. The introductions were brief and dismissive, clearly designed to limit her access to detailed information. During a tour of the facilities, Webb kept up a running commentary that was part legitimate information and part continued demonstration of his superiority. I suppose this all looks very impressive to someone from your background, he said as they walked through the motor pool. But when you've managed vehicle maintenance under combat conditions, civilian standards seem pretty relaxed. Sarah examined the equipment and maintenance records with the trained eye of someone who had indeed managed much larger and more complex operations, but she kept her observations to herself. The assessment she was conducting went far beyond simple facility management, and Webb's behavior was providing valuable insight into the command climate and leadership effectiveness. At lunch in the officers' mess, Webb made a point of introducing her to other senior staff with comments like, "This is the young lady from Washington who's here to tell us how to do our jobs." The other officers were polite, but clearly taking their cue from their commanding officer about how to treat her. Throughout these interactions, Sarah noticed the careful way subordinates approached Webb, the hesitant manner in which they asked questions, and the visible relief when they were dismissed. It painted a picture of a command environment based on fear rather than respect, where initiative was discouraged and independent thinking was seen as a challenge to authority. The afternoon brought meetings with various department heads, each introduction accompanied by Webb's dismissive commentary about civilian oversight and Washington bureaucracy. Sarah found herself in the position of being simultaneously insulted and ignored while trying to conduct a serious assessment of military readiness and leadership effectiveness. As the day drew to a close, Webb seemed pleased with how he had handled the situation. "Well, Miss Mitchell, I hope you got what you came for. I'm sure you'll write a very thorough report about our coffee quality and office organization for whoever sent you." Sarah gathered her notes and prepared to leave, maintaining the same professional demeanor she had displayed throughout the day. "Thank you for your time, Colonel. This has been very informative." "I'm sure it has," Webb replied with obvious satisfaction. "Maybe next time they'll send someone with actual military experience if they want to understand how a real operation works." As Sarah walked back to her car, she reflected on the day's interactions. Colonel Webb had revealed far more about himself and his leadership style than he realized. His arrogance, sexism, and dismissive attitude toward oversight were exactly the kind of issues her assessment was designed to identify. What Webb didn't know, and what would soon become devastatingly clear, was that the young woman he had spent the day patronizing and insulting held a rank that made his position look insignificant by comparison. The real revelation was yet to come, and it would fundamentally change his understanding of just how seriously he had underestimated both the situation and the person conducting his evaluation. The foundation had been laid for a confrontation that would expose not just his prejudices and poor judgment, but the fundamental flaws in a leadership approach that prioritized ego over effectiveness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges to his assumptions, and the comfortable bubble of his supposed superiority was about to burst in ways he could never have anticipated. The second day of Sarah's assessment began much the same as the first, with Colonel Webb greeting her arrival with barely concealed irritation and continued condescension. He had apparently spent the evening congratulating himself on how well he had handled the Washington bureaucrat, completely missing the significance of her careful observations and pointed questions. "Back for more punishment, I see," Webb said as Sarah entered his office. "I have to admire your persistence, even if I question the value of what you're doing here." Sarah had spent the previous evening reviewing her notes and preparing for deeper investigation into the command structure and operational procedures. Her preliminary observations had raised several red flags about leadership effectiveness and unit morale that required more detailed examination. "I'd like to spend some time today observing training exercises and speaking with personnel at various levels," she said, settling into the chair across from Webb's desk. "I understand you have a field training exercise scheduled this morning." Webb leaned back with an expression of amused disbelief. "You want to observe field training, Miss Mitchell? These are combat exercises with live ammunition and complex tactical scenarios. This isn't some corporate team-building exercise you can just sit in on. These soldiers are training for real combat situations." The patronizing tone was even more pronounced than the day before, as Webb seemed to have convinced himself that her presence was nothing more than a minor administrative inconvenience. "I appreciate your concern for my safety, Colonel, but I do have experience with military training operations." "Experience?" Webb repeated with a laugh. "Right. Look, I'm sure someone gave you a briefing about military procedures, maybe even let you watch some training videos, but that's not the same as understanding what actually happens when soldiers are under stress. These exercises simulate real combat conditions." He stood up and walked to a tactical map on the wall, pointing to various positions marked with colored pins. "Today's scenario involves a battalion-level operation with multiple objectives, coordinated air support, and enemy contact simulation. The soldiers will be moving through difficult terrain under combat load, making split-second tactical decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." Sarah studied the map with interest, noting the complexity of the exercise and the tactical considerations involved. Her own experience with similar operations was extensive, though Webb had no way of knowing that. It sounds like an excellent training opportunity. I'd appreciate the chance to observe how your personnel handle these challenges. Webb turned back to her with an expression that suggested he was dealing with a particularly slow child. Miss Mitchell, you can't just wander around a training area asking soldiers questions while they're trying to concentrate on not getting killed. These exercises require absolute focus and discipline. Having some civilian consultant poking around would be a dangerous distraction. I understand the need for safety and focus, Sarah replied calmly. Perhaps I could observe from a command post or designated observation area? The suggestion seemed to irritate Webb even more. The command post is where real military decisions are being made in real time. It's not a place for tourists or bureaucrats to satisfy their curiosity about how the Army works. These officers are coordinating complex operations that require years of training and experience to understand. Despite his objections, Webb eventually agreed to allow her to observe from a distant position, clearly believing that she would quickly become bored or overwhelmed by the complexity of what she was witnessing. He assigned a junior officer to babysit her, as he put it, and make sure she didn't interfere with the exercise. The training area was several miles from the main base, accessed by rough terrain that tested both vehicles and passengers. During the drive, Webb kept up his commentary about the challenges of military leadership and the impossibility of understanding such operations from an outside perspective. What you're about to see, he explained, is the result of months of planning and preparation. Every element has been carefully coordinated, from logistics support to communications protocols. It's the kind of complex operation that requires real military experience to appreciate. At the observation point, Sarah was positioned behind sandbags with a pair of binoculars while Webb took his place at the actual command post several hundred yards away. The young lieutenant assigned to watch her seemed embarrassed by the task and apologetic about the colonel's attitude. "Ma'am, the colonel means well," the lieutenant said quietly. "He just takes training very seriously and doesn't like outside interference." Sarah smiled at the young officer's diplomatic explanation. "I understand completely, Lieutenant. I'm here to learn, not to interfere." As the exercise began, Sarah observed with the trained eye of someone who had planned and executed similar operations on a much larger scale. The battalion's movement was generally competent, but showed several areas where coordination could be improved. The communication protocols were adequate but not optimized for the complex terrain they were operating in. From her position, she could hear Webb's voice over the radio, directing various elements of the exercise with the kind of micromanagement that suggested either lack of trust in subordinate commanders or an inflated sense of his own tactical importance. His communications were sharp and demanding, leaving little room for initiative from company and platoon leaders. "Bravo, company, what's your status?" Webb's voice crackled over the radio. "You should have reached checkpoint 3 5 minutes ago. Are you having navigation problems?" The company commander's response was tense and defensive, clearly uncomfortable with the public criticism being broadcast to the entire exercise. "Colonel, we encountered unexpected obstacles that required a route adjustment. We're moving to checkpoint 3 now." Unexpected obstacles? Webb's tone was sardonic. "In combat, Lieutenant Colonel, there are always unexpected obstacles. That's why we plan for contingencies and maintain proper movement schedules. Figure it out and get your people moving." Sarah made mental notes about the exchange, recognizing the pattern of public humiliation and micromanagement that often indicated deeper leadership problems. Effective commanders trusted their subordinates to adapt to changing circumstances and provided support rather than criticism when challenges arose. The exercise continued with Webb maintaining a constant stream of commentary and criticism that seemed designed more to demonstrate his superior knowledge than to actually improve the training value for the participating units. His interventions often interrupted the natural flow of the exercise and prevented junior leaders from developing their own tactical problem-solving skills. During a particularly complex phase of the operation, when multiple units were converging on a simulated enemy position, Sarah observed a breakdown in coordination that could have been easily prevented with better communication protocols. The units were using overlapping radio frequencies that created confusion, and their approach routes hadn't been properly deconflicted. From her observation position, she could see the developing problem before it became critical. Two companies were advancing along converging paths that would put them in each other's line of fire. while a third unit was moving into a position where they could be mistaken for enemy forces by the other two groups. The lieutenant beside her was also watching with growing concern. "That doesn't look right," he murmured, studying the movement patterns through his own binoculars. Sarah keyed the radio she had been given for safety purposes. "Command, this is Observer 1. I'm seeing a potential blue-on-blue situation developing at grid reference 345789. Bravo and Charlie companies are converging with overlapping fields of fire." Webb's voice came back immediately, sharp with irritation. "Observer 1, you are not authorized to provide tactical input. Maintain radio silence and observe only." "Colonel, I believe there's a safety concern," Sarah began, but Webb cut her off. "Miss Mitchell, I told you yesterday that this isn't some academic exercise you can participate in. These are my soldiers conducting my training exercise, and I don't need input from someone who has never led troops in combat." The situation continued to develop as Sarah had predicted, with the units moving into increasingly dangerous positions relative to each other. The communication problems that had created the situation in the first place were preventing the unit commanders from recognizing the developing problem. Finally, the senior umpire for the exercise called a halt to prevent what could have become a serious accident. The after-action review revealed exactly the issues that Sarah had identified, leading to an uncomfortable moment when Webb was forced to acknowledge that his dismissal of her warning had been premature. "Sometimes civilians get lucky with their guesses," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "Even a stopped clock is right twice a day." The comment was clearly intended to minimize her contribution and maintain his authority. But Sarah noticed the looks exchanged between some of the other officers. They had heard her warning and seen Webb's response, and they understood the implications of what had almost happened. After the exercise concluded, Sarah accompanied Webb back to his office for what he called a debriefing, though it quickly became apparent that he intended it to be another opportunity to lecture her about military operations and her own limitations. "I hope today gave you some appreciation for the complexity of what we do here," Webb began, settling behind his desk with obvious satisfaction. "Military operations aren't something you can understand from reading reports or attending briefings. They require the kind of experience and judgment that comes from years of active service." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. The exercise was certainly educational. "I noticed some interesting aspects of the communication protocols and coordination procedures." "Oh, I'm sure you did," Webb replied with a condescending smile. "And I'm sure you have all sorts of ideas about how we could do things better based on your vast experience with military operations." The sarcasm was heavy enough to cut with a knife, but Sarah maintained her professional demeanor. "Actually, I was curious about the decision to use overlapping radio frequencies for units operating in close proximity. In my experience, that can create the kind of communication problems that led to the coordination breakdown during the final phase." Webb's expression shifted slightly, clearly annoyed that she was focusing on a legitimate tactical issue rather than simply accepting his superior expertise. "Miss Mitchell, radio frequency management is a complex technical issue that requires understanding of signal propagation, equipment capabilities, and operational security considerations. It's not something that can be understood without proper military communications training." "I understand the technical challenges," Sarah replied, "but the practical result seemed to be that critical information wasn't being passed between units at a crucial moment." "The practical result," Webb said, his voice rising slightly, "was a valuable learning experience for those unit commanders about the importance of maintaining situational awareness and adapting to communications challenges. That's what training is for, to identify weaknesses and correct them." Sarah made a note in her ever-present notebook. "So the communication breakdown was intentional?" Webb realized he had backed himself into a corner but pressed on with increasing defensiveness. "Not intentional, but not unexpected either. Real combat operations involve equipment failures, interference, and all sorts of communications challenges. We train under realistic conditions so our soldiers learn to overcome these obstacles." "Including obstacles that could result in friendly fire incidents?" Sarah asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a moment as Webb struggled with how to respond. He couldn't admit that the situation had been dangerous without acknowledging that her warning had been legitimate, but he also couldn't claim that friendly fire was an acceptable training outcome. "Miss Mitchell, combat involves risks, calculated risks that experienced commanders understand and manage appropriately. What you saw today was a training scenario being conducted under proper safety protocols with qualified supervision. except that the qualified supervision ignored a warning about the developing safety issue, Sarah pointed out. Webb's face flushed slightly. I made a command decision based on my assessment of the situation and my understanding of my soldiers' capabilities. That's what command authority means. The responsibility and authority to make decisions in the moment. The afternoon brought additional meetings with department heads and staff officers, but Webb's attitude had shifted noticeably. Where the previous day he had been dismissive but relatively relaxed, he now seemed defensive and irritated. Sarah's observations during the training exercise had clearly unsettled him, though he was trying hard not to show it. During a meeting with the base's intelligence officer, Sarah asked detailed questions about threat assessment procedures and information-sharing protocols that revealed a level of knowledge about military intelligence operations that surprised everyone present. Her questions were too specific and too well-informed to come from someone with only civilian experience. "You seem to know quite a bit about intelligence procedures," the officer commented. "Do you have a background in that field?" Before Sarah could respond, Webb interjected with obvious irritation. "Major, Miss Mitchell is a civilian consultant with some theoretical knowledge about military operations. I'm sure her questions come from whatever briefing materials she studied before coming here." The intelligence officer looked between them with confusion, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. Sarah simply smiled and moved on to her next question, but the seeds of doubt about her true background had been planted. As the day progressed, Webb found himself increasingly frustrated by Sarah's persistent questions and apparent expertise in areas where she supposedly had no experience. Her observations were too accurate, her questions too sophisticated, and her understanding of military procedures too detailed for someone with only civilian background. The final straw came during a discussion about personnel management and unit readiness reports. Sarah asked about specific reporting requirements and evaluation criteria that were known only to senior military officials. Questions that revealed an intimate familiarity with high-level military administration. "How exactly do you know about those reporting requirements?" Webb demanded, his patience finally exhausted. "Those are internal military procedures that aren't shared with civilian contractors." Sarah looked at him calmly. "I've had occasion to work with similar requirements in other contexts." "What contexts?" Webb pressed. "What exactly is your background, Miss Mitchell? Because what I've been seeing today doesn't match the story I was told about some consultant from Washington." The confrontation was building toward a revelation that would fundamentally change the dynamic between them. But for now, Sarah maintained her cover while continuing to document the leadership failures and command climate issues that her assessment was designed to identify. Webb's growing suspicion and defensiveness were revealing as much about his character and capabilities as his previous arrogance and dismissiveness. The foundation was being laid for a reckoning that would expose the full extent of his misjudgment about both the situation and the woman he had been so casually insulting. The truth was closer than he realized, and when it finally emerged, it would shatter every assumption he had made about authority, expertise, and the wisdom of judging people by their appearance rather than their capabilities. The third day brought an escalation of tensions as Colonel Webb's suspicions about Sarah's true identity began to consume his thoughts. He had spent the previous evening reviewing their interactions and growing increasingly uncomfortable with the depth of her knowledge and the precision of her observations. Something wasn't adding up, and his usual confidence was beginning to crack under the weight of doubt. Webb arrived at his office early, determined to regain control of what he was beginning to see as a deteriorating situation. When Sarah appeared for their scheduled morning meeting, he was ready with a more aggressive approach designed to expose what he believed was some kind of deception about her background and qualifications. "Miss Mitchell," he began without preamble, "I've been thinking about our conversations over the past 2 days, and I have some concerns about the accuracy of the information I was given about your background and purpose here." Sarah settled into her chair with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout their interactions. "What kind of concerns, Colonel?" "The kind of concerns that arise when someone claims to be a civilian consultant but demonstrates knowledge of classified military procedures and operational details that aren't available to outsiders," Webb replied, leaning forward aggressively. "I want to know exactly who you are and what you're really doing here." The accusation hung in the air between them, as Webb waited for what he expected would be either a confession or a defensive reaction that would reveal the deception he was convinced existed. Instead, Sarah simply made a note in her ever-present notebook and looked back at him expectantly. I understand your concerns, Colonel. However, my credentials were verified by your headquarters before my arrival. Perhaps we could focus on the assessment procedures that brought me here. Webb's frustration flared at her continued refusal to be intimidated or defensive. Don't give me that bureaucratic nonsense. I've been in this army for 20 years, and I know the difference between someone who's read about military operations and someone who's actually been involved in them. Your questions yesterday weren't the questions of some civilian analyst. What specific questions concerned you? Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notebook as if this were simply another routine inquiry rather than what Webb intended as a confrontation. The calm response only increased Webb's agitation. Your understanding of intelligence protocols, your knowledge of command structures, your familiarity with operational procedures, none of it matches the story I was told about some Washington consultant conducting a routine assessment. Sarah considered this for a moment before responding. Colonel, my job is to conduct thorough assessments of military installations and their operations. That requires a certain level of knowledge about how these systems work. I'm not sure why that would be concerning. Because, Webb said, standing up and beginning to pace behind his desk, that level of knowledge doesn't come from reading reports or attending briefings. It comes from actually doing the job, making the decisions, and living with the consequences. And if you have that kind of experience, then someone has been lying to me about who you are. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door, and Webb's aide entered with a message that appeared to be urgent. Colonel, I have General Harrison on line 2. He says it's important. Webb glanced at Sarah and then back at his aide. Tell the general I'll call him back in 15 minutes. I'm in the middle of something important here. Sir, he specifically asked to speak with you immediately. He said it concerns the assessment being conducted on base. The mention of the assessment caught Webb's attention, and he looked at Sarah with renewed suspicion. Did you contact General Harrison about our conversations? No, Colonel, I haven't had any contact with General Harrison. Sarah replied truthfully, though she suspected what the call might be about. Webb picked up the phone with obvious reluctance, clearly unhappy about interrupting his interrogation but unable to ignore a direct communication from a general officer. General Harrison, this is Colonel Webb. I understand you wanted to speak with me about the assessment. Sarah could hear only Webb's side of the conversation, but his expression changed dramatically as he listened to whatever the general was telling him. His confident aggression faded into confusion, and then something approaching alarm as the conversation continued. Yes, sir, she's here now, Webb said, glancing at Sarah with a look that was completely different from his previous dismissive arrogance. I understand, sir. Yes, sir, immediately. He hung up the phone and stared at Sarah for a long moment, his mind clearly racing to process whatever information he had just received. The comfortable superiority that had characterized his attitude for the past 2 days had vanished, replaced by obvious uncertainty and growing concern. General Harrison would like to speak with you, Webb said finally, his tone notably more respectful than it had been moments earlier. He's asked me to arrange a secure communication link immediately. Sarah nodded and followed Webb to a secured communications room, where he established the encrypted connection with obviously trembling hands. His entire demeanor had changed from aggressive interrogator to nervous subordinate in the span of a single phone call. General Harrison, Colonel Webb has established the secure link. Miss Mitchell is here, Webb announced into the secure phone system. Thank you, Colonel. Please remain on the line, came the general's voice through the speakers. Miss Mitchell, I apologize for interrupting your assessment, but I've received some concerning reports about the cooperation you're receiving at Colonel Webb's installation. Sarah glanced at Webb, whose face had gone pale as he began to understand that this conversation wasn't going the way he had expected. Thank you for calling, General. I appreciate your concern for the smooth conduct of the assessment. I want to make sure that Colonel Webb understands the importance of this evaluation and the need for complete cooperation with your mission. I also want to clarify any misunderstandings about your authority and background. Webb's eyes widened as the implications of the general's words began to sink in. This wasn't a conversation between equals discussing some routine administrative matter. This was a senior general personally, calling to ensure that Sarah's mission was being properly supported. General, Webb interjected nervously, I want to assure you that I provided complete cooperation. If there's been any misunderstanding, Colonel Webb, The general's voice cut through his explanation with unmistakable authority. I'm going to be very clear about something that apparently wasn't made clear to you initially. The person conducting this assessment isn't some routine civilian consultant. This is a direct Pentagon inspection ordered at the highest levels. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. A direct Pentagon inspection meant scrutiny that could end careers and change the entire future of his command. More importantly, it meant that Sarah represented authority far above his own pay grade. Furthermore, the general continued, I want to make absolutely certain that you understand who you're dealing with. Miss Mitchell's actual rank and position were classified for operational security reasons, but given the reports I'm receiving, I think clarification is necessary. Webb looked at Sarah with growing horror as the general's words painted a picture completely different from his assumptions about her background and authority. The confident dismissiveness that had characterized his treatment of her suddenly seemed not just inappropriate but potentially catastrophic for his career. Sir, I'm not sure I understand, Webb managed to say, though his voice suggested he was beginning to understand all too well. Colonel Webb, the woman you've been treating as some junior civilian consultant, actually holds a rank significantly higher than your own. The assessment she's conducting has the full authority of the Pentagon, and your cooperation isn't just requested. It's absolutely mandatory. The revelation hit Webb with devastating force. Everything about the past 2 days suddenly made horrible sense. Her detailed knowledge of military procedures, her sophisticated understanding of operations, her calm confidence in the face of his dismissive treatment. She hadn't been some inexperienced civilian trying to understand military operations. She had been a senior military officer conducting an official evaluation while he treated her like an annoying distraction. I think Colonel Webb is beginning to understand the situation, Sarah said calmly into the phone. Perhaps we can proceed with the assessment now that the communication issues have been clarified. Absolutely, the general replied. Colonel Webb, I trust that the remainder of this assessment will proceed with the full cooperation and respect that this mission deserves. Is that understood? Yes, sir, completely understood, Webb replied, his voice barely above a whisper as the full magnitude of his mistake began to dawn on him. After the call ended, the communications room fell silent as Webb tried to process what had just happened. 2 days of condescending lectures, dismissive comments, and patronizing behavior suddenly looked like career-ending mistakes rather than demonstrations of his superior knowledge and experience. Ma'am, he began hesitantly, the word sweetheart that he had used so casually now seeming like evidence of his complete failure to recognize the person he was dealing with. Colonel, Sarah replied professionally, I think we should return to your office and continue the assessment. There are still several areas I need to examine before completing my report. The walk back to Webb's office was conducted in complete silence as he struggled to understand how badly he had misjudged both the situation and the person conducting it. Every conversation, every dismissive comment, every patronizing lecture now appeared to have been observed and documented by someone with the authority to end his military career with a single negative report. Back in his office, Webb attempted to salvage what he could from the wreckage of the past 2 days. Ma'am, if I may ask, what exactly is your position and rank? Sarah looked at him with an expression that was professional but not unkind. Colonel, my specific rank and position are still classified for operational security reasons. What's important for you to understand is that this assessment is being conducted with full Pentagon authority, and your cooperation is essential. I understand, ma'am, Webb replied, though his voice suggested he was still struggling to comprehend the full scope of his mistake. I want to assure you that any issues with cooperation were based on misunderstanding, not intentional disrespect. I appreciate that, Colonel. However, my assessment isn't just about cooperation. It's about leadership effectiveness, command climate, and operational readiness. The past 2 days have provided significant insight into all of those areas. The words were delivered without malice, but their implications were devastating. Webb realized that while he thought he had been demonstrating his superior knowledge and experience, he had actually been revealing serious flaws in his leadership approach and professional judgment under the observation of someone with the authority to document those flaws in an official Pentagon report. Ma'am, I hope you'll consider that my behavior was based on incomplete information about the nature of your mission, Webb said desperately. If I had understood, Colonel, Sarah interrupted gently. How you treat people when you think they have no authority over you is often more revealing than how you treat them when you know they do. That's actually an important part of what this assessment is designed to evaluate. The statement struck Webb with its obvious truth and devastating implications. His treatment of Sarah when he believed her to be a powerless civilian consultant had revealed exactly the kind of character and leadership flaws that a Pentagon assessment was designed to identify. The remainder of the day proceeded with Webb in a state of barely controlled panic, as he tried to undo 2 days of documented poor judgment and inappropriate behavior. Every question Sarah asked, every note she made, every observation she recorded, now carried the weight of potential career destruction. His desperate attempts to be helpful and respectful only highlighted the contrast with his previous dismissive arrogance, creating an even more damaging picture of an officer whose behavior was determined entirely by the perceived power and authority of the person he was dealing with. As the day drew to a close, Webb realized that his comfortable world of unquestioned authority and assumed superiority had been completely shattered by his own actions and assumptions. The young woman he had spent 2 days patronizing and insulting held power that made his position look insignificant, and she had documented every moment of his unprofessional behavior with the precision of someone trained to evaluate exactly these kinds of leadership failures. The full revelation was yet to come, but the foundation had been laid for a reckoning that would expose not just his poor judgment about Sarah's identity, but fundamental flaws in his character and approach to leadership that no amount of damage control could repair. The final day of Sarah's assessment arrived with Colonel Webb in a state of barely concealed desperation. He had spent the night reviewing every interaction from the past 3 days, and each memory seemed worse than the last. The patronizing comments, the dismissive attitude, the condescending lectures, all delivered to someone whose true authority he was only beginning to comprehend. Webb arrived at his office early, hoping to prepare some kind of strategy for damage control, but found Sarah already waiting for him with what appeared to be a completed assessment file. The sight of the thick folder filled with her observations and notes sent a chill through him as he realized that his career might already be over. "Good morning, Colonel," Sarah said with the same professional courtesy she had maintained throughout their interactions, though now Webb understood that her composure had been that of someone accustomed to far greater authority and responsibility than his own. "Good morning, ma'am," Webb replied, the respectful address feeling strange after days of casual dismissiveness. "I hope you found your accommodation satisfactory." The attempt at polite conversation felt hollow and desperate, but Webb was grasping for any way to establish a more positive tone for what he feared would be their final interaction. Sarah simply nodded and opened her assessment folder, the action making Webb's stomach clench with anxiety. "Colonel, before we conclude this assessment, I want to review some of my observations with you and give you an opportunity to provide additional context or clarification," Sarah began, her tone remaining professional but businesslike. Webb felt a flicker of hope. If she was asking for his input, perhaps there was still a chance to influence the final report. "Of course, ma'am, I'm happy to provide any clarification or context that might be helpful." Sarah consulted her notes and began with what seemed like routine operational issues. "I've observed some concerns about communication protocols during training exercises, particularly the coordination between units operating in close proximity. Can you walk me through your standard procedures for preventing friendly fire incidents?" The question was straightforward enough, but Webb now understood that every answer was being evaluated by someone with far more experience and expertise than his own. His previous confidence in his military knowledge seemed laughable in retrospect. "We follow standard Army protocols for unit identification and communication procedures," Webb began carefully. "Each unit maintains constant radio contact with the command post, and we use established challenge and response procedures for identification. I noticed during Tuesday's exercise that overlapping radio frequencies created communication difficulties that contributed to the coordination breakdown. How do you typically address those technical challenges?" Sarah asked, making notes as Webb responded. Webb realized she was giving him another opportunity to demonstrate his understanding of the tactical situation, but now he knew that his answer was being evaluated by someone who had probably managed far more complex operations than anything he had ever supervised. "The frequency assignments are made at brigade level based on available spectrum and operational security considerations," he replied. "Sometimes we have to work within constraints that aren't ideal for the specific exercise we're conducting." Sarah made another note and moved on to questions about leadership and personnel management that struck much closer to Webb's core fears about the assessment. I've observed your interactions with subordinate officers and enlisted personnel. Can you describe your leadership philosophy and how you work to develop your junior leaders? The question felt like walking into a minefield. Webb's treatment of his subordinates over the past 3 days had been documented by someone who now understood exactly what effective military leadership looked like, and his aggressive micromanaging style had been on full display. I believe in maintaining high standards and clear expectations, Webb said, trying to frame his approach in the most positive terms possible. Military leadership requires decisive authority and the ability to make tough decisions under pressure. How do you balance that authority with developing initiative and decision-making capabilities in your subordinate commanders? Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Webb struggled with the question because it highlighted one of the fundamental flaws in his leadership approach that had been evident throughout their interactions. His tendency to micromanage and publicly criticize subordinates was the opposite of developing their capabilities and confidence. It's a delicate balance, he replied weakly. You have to maintain control while giving people room to learn and grow. The inadequacy of his answer was obvious even to him, and Sarah's professional nod as she made her notes suggested that she had identified the disconnect between his stated philosophy and his observed behavior. The interview continued with increasingly pointed questions about command, climate, personnel development, and operational effectiveness. Each question revealed another area where Webb's actual performance fell short of military leadership standards, and his growing awareness of Sarah's true expertise made each failure more obvious and more damaging. Finally, Sarah closed her notebook and looked directly at Webb with an expression that was professional but unmistakably serious. Colonel, I think it's time for complete transparency about this assessment and my role here. Webb felt his blood pressure spike as he braced himself for what he knew would be a devastating revelation about just how badly he had misjudged both the situation and the person conducting his evaluation. This assessment was ordered directly by the Pentagon following concerns about leadership effectiveness and unit readiness at your installation, Sarah began. Those concerns were serious enough to warrant sending someone with the authority to make immediate recommendations about command changes if necessary. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. Command changes meant his relief and the end of his military career in disgrace. Everything he had worked for over 20 years was hanging in the balance, and he had spent the past 3 days demonstrating every leadership failure that could justify his removal. Ma'am, he began desperately, I want you to know that if I had understood the nature of your mission, Colonel, Sarah interrupted, how you treat people when you think they have no power over you reveals your true character. That's exactly what this assessment was designed to evaluate. She opened her folder and pulled out what appeared to be official military identification credentials. I think it's time you understood exactly who has been observing your leadership style for the past 3 days. Webb looked at the credentials and felt the world shift beneath him. The identification showed Sarah's true rank and position, and it was so far above his own level that the past 3 days of condescending lectures and dismissive treatment now seemed like acts of incredible stupidity rather than demonstrations of his superior experience. Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell, Pentagon Inspector General's Office, Sarah said simply. I'm here conducting a direct assessment of your command on behalf of the Secretary of the Army. The revelation struck Webb with devastating force. He had spent 3 days treating a general officer like an inexperienced civilian, lecturing her about military operations she understood far better than he ever would, and demonstrating every leadership failure that could justify his immediate relief from command. Ma'am, I had no idea, Webb stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment and growing panic. If I had known. Colonel, that's exactly the point, General Mitchell replied calmly. Your behavior towards someone you believed to be powerless revealed everything this assessment needed to know about your leadership character and command climate. Webb realized that every condescending comment, every dismissive lecture, every patronizing explanation had been observed and documented by someone with the authority to end his career with a single recommendation. His assumptions about his own superiority and her ignorance had led him to reveal exactly the kind of character flaws that justified relief from command. The purpose of this assessment was to evaluate whether the concerns about your leadership style were justified. General Mitchell continued. Your treatment of subordinates, your attitude toward oversight, and your response to challenges to your authority have all been thoroughly documented. Webb understood that his desperate attempts at damage control over the past day had only made things worse by highlighting the contrast between how he treated people based on their perceived authority and power. His character had been revealed through his own actions, and no amount of explanation could undo that revelation. "Ma'am, I hope you'll consider that my behavior was based on misunderstanding the situation," Webb said, though he knew how weak and desperate the plea sounded. General Mitchell looked at him with an expression that was professional but not unkind. "Colonel, effective leadership isn't conditional on knowing someone's rank or position. How you treat people reveals who you are as a leader and as a person." She closed her folder and stood up, the action signaling that the assessment was complete and his fate had been decided. "You'll receive official notification of my recommendations through proper channels within the next 72 hours. Webb knew that those recommendations would almost certainly include his relief from command, and probably the effective end of his military career. The 3 days of documented leadership failures observed by a general officer would be impossible to overcome or explain away. "General, is there anything I can do to—" Webb began, but stopped himself as he realized how pathetic the question sounded. "Colonel, the time for demonstrating effective leadership was during the past 3 days. This assessment captured exactly what it was designed to capture: your true approach to command and your actual treatment of people under your authority." As General Mitchell prepared to leave, Webb was left to contemplate the complete destruction of everything he had built over his 20-year military career. His arrogance, sexism, and dismissive attitude toward someone he perceived as powerless had been observed and documented by exactly the person with the authority to hold him accountable for those failures. The irony was devastating and complete. His assumptions about his own superiority and her ignorance had led him to reveal exactly the character flaws that justified his relief from command. The young woman he had patronized and dismissed was actually a general officer, whose expertise and authority made his position look insignificant by comparison. In trying to demonstrate his superior knowledge and experience to someone he believed to be beneath him, Webb had instead revealed fundamental flaws in his character and leadership approach that no amount of technical competence could compensate for. The assessment had captured exactly what it was designed to capture, and the results would reshape not just his career, but his entire understanding of leadership, authority, and the dangerous consequences of judging people by their appearance. As General Mitchell left his office for the final time, Webb was left alone with the wreckage of his assumptions and the devastating knowledge that his own arrogance and prejudice had provided all the evidence necessary to end his military career. The colonel, who had spent 3 days ridiculing someone he believed to be his inferior, had discovered in the most humiliating way possible that she ranked far above him, and had been watching, evaluating, and documenting his every failure as a leader and as a human being. The revelation was complete, the assessment was finished, and the consequences of his monumental misjudgment would soon follow through official channels that would make his disgrace a matter of permanent military record. Colonel Webb had learned, far too late, that true authority doesn't announce itself with uniforms and titles, and that the most dangerous assumptions are those we make about people based on our own limited understanding of power, position, and worth.